So let me begin by telling you a little bit about why I began researching this particular topic, this broader project. And then, basically the research I'm going to be talking to you about today is really the result of two papers that were published recently, one in the Management Communication Quarterly and the other in Human Relations. You can probably access those two articles from your library database. But you can easily download them. If not, then I'll just send them across. I should also say, I don't know if you guys can hear the humming going on over here in my room. We had a power outage, so basically it's a generator system over here. It's really, really hot. So apologies if that noise is coming into you. So when I went into grad school, I really wanted to look at how organizations really make those key strategic decisions about their brand, about their ethics, about why they're responsible to all of these different stakeholders, and to what extent this responsibility trumps other, say, business concerns. And the reason I was really interested in this is largely because I had a practitioner background in public relations and in business marketing as well. Sorry, not business marketing, business journalism. I worked at CNBC India, TV18 for a while, and then I worked with Times Now for about a year before moving to Concept PR in Bombay, where I worked with them for about a year and a half. And that trajectory sort of really made me interested in this tussle, I guess, between the strategic aspects of responsibility and the altruistic, or the I wouldn't even say altruistic anymore, the necessity of action, right? With the dire effects of climate change, for instance, being so evident everywhere around. I mean, just this past summer, my mother was telling me, my mother is in Calcutta, she was telling me, we've never had summers this hot before. This is really different for us. So that tussle is something I really wanted to address. The problem was, though, the more I sort of started delving into the CSR literature and the corporate social responsibility literature, as some of you who do work in that area already know, is really broad, is really interdisciplinary, right? Because you have scholars from management, business ethics, philosophy, sociologies, vocational psychology, communication, of course. Sociology. So you have all of these scholars with their own principles, with their own theoretical assumptions, addressing what corporate social responsibility means in different contexts. And that should be a good thing in theory, right? Because if you have all of this interdisciplinary intermingling, the idea is that you are going to come up with something new and special that not any one theory alone, that any one discipline alone would be able to find. The problem was, though, the CSR frameworks, I realized, at least for me, they didn't really quite seem to go far enough. A lot of it focused on social performance issues, which was really focused on, well, how should the firm make, again, a strategic decision? What is the impact of a CSR measure or a CSR initiative? How can we sort of quantify this in different ways? And of course, there are qualitative studies as well. There's a lot of qualitative research on CSR as well. But for me, the problem was a lot of it sort of tended to begin and end with the organization, right? And as management scholars, of course, that makes sense. You know, your focus of interest is the firm and how decisions are made in the firm. But for me, I really wanted to understand, how does a firm understand its responsibility with these broader issues, with climate change, for instance, with the need to curb fossil fuels, the need to curb travel. With the COVID-19 situation, for instance, a lot of people have talked about how the skies are clearer, how nature has seemed to sort of re-healed herself in so many ways that was not possible before COVID-19. So these were these big picture issues, big picture questions that the CSR frameworks did not seem quite capable to me to answer them. So that's why I sort of wanted to go down a different route. And so I started looking at the literature on sustainable organizing. When I started this research, the work on sustainability was not necessarily as developed. It is definitely really well developed today, and it's progressing by leaps and bounds. It is also an interdisciplinary concept like CSR, which is wonderful. The difference, though, is that it does take a big picture, a big question assumption from the get-go, right? Because it does not presume that the firm's interests are the most important interests that have to be taken into account. The sustainability framework really looks at this intersection of people and planet and profits. For those of you who might be familiar with the term sustainable development, it was really developed by the United Nations. I should probably have said that. I'm not using slides, by the way. So I thought, this is much more fun to just do a conversation. So I'm going to probably just jump in and ask you guys to chime in and answer maybe a few questions. So I'm not using slides. So it comes from the United Nations, from the Brundtland report. Brundtland basically was I forget if she was a prime minister or the president. I think she was a prime minister of Norway. She chaired this committee that really came up with this definition of sustainable development. So how many of you know? So this is the part where I sort of throw the question back at you guys. How many of you know what the traditional definition of sustainable development is? Just take a chance. What is sustainability? No? Okay. So sustainable development is traditionally defined as development that meets the needs of the present generation without impinging on the growth of the future generation. That's the traditional definition. And if you look at that traditional definition, you know right away that although it doesn't really take a firm-centric approach, right, like the CSR framework does, it does take an economic development-centered approach. So the very traditional definition of sustainability did suffer from some of these problems. And it has been criticized, actually, by politicians, by activists, by scholars, of course, as simply not going far enough. If we really need to curb fossil fuel growth and really bring down the temperature of the world by 2 degrees Celsius, simply focusing on economic development is not going to go far enough. And so although even the framework of sustainability really talks about this intersection, right, of society, of politics, of economics, of welfare, and yes, the environment itself, in practical terms, the measurement of the term sustainable development was still very much grounded in economic development measures. So what did I try to do? What every person in any discipline tries to do when they're looking at a problem is essentially trying to say, well, what does my field add to this conversation, right? How can my perspective, the theoretical principles that I've applied in my research, how can they sort of help reframe this question maybe, and thus help us find a better, more appropriate answer? And that's basically what I tried to do. So I took on a more communication-centered perspective because my discipline is communication. I got my PhD out of Purdue University from the Department of Communication. So how people communicate, right, about different things. And it could be organizational things, or it could be climate-related things. It could be, the health of the planet-related things. So my central question, therefore, was, how does a communication-centered perspective help us maybe address this issue of, sustainability and maybe not going far enough? With that starting question in mind, as I delve further into the literature, so literature review, I'm sure all of you are finding right now is so important, right? Because it is important to help develop your research question. And once you've got your research question, it's important to help refine your research question. And so it was the same way with me, because I realized that it's not that there was a lack of sufficient definitions of sustainability, which really took on this more environment-centered focus or a more social-centered focus, as apart from the development-centered focus. There were all of these competing definitions and frameworks of sustainability. But what I noticed, though, in terms of a lack, was that, who was making these definitions? And it was usually the people on top, the policymakers, the politicians, and of course that makes sense, right? When we think about how policies are made, it generally is the policymakers, the politicians who do that. But if we only focus on the policymakers on top who are making the policy, there's a very real danger that the definitions that they come up with are out of touch with the realities that most people are dealing with on an everyday basis. And arguably, we actually see that a lot with the climate issue, because we have all these wonderful, measures of sustainability that supposedly get at what's supposed to happen and how we should address people's, their hesitation about moving on to a low carbon economy, for instance. But obviously, those measures don't work because people remain very hesitant about moving to a low carbon economy. Those messages that politicians and the policymakers had been creating about what sustainability is and how we can accomplish that were obviously not touching a chord somewhere, right? That's pretty much what I argue. There was a disconnect in terms of, the overview definition of sustainability, which the policymakers define and which we are as scholars, we are very familiar with. But and then the other definition of sustainability that ordinary people, lay people really had. I was really more interested in something between these two definitions or frameworks. And I was really interested in, well, how do the people who are doing the work of sustainability, they're not necessarily the the fancy people, the policymakers who are making this wonderful policy on the ground, who are making this wonderful policy up there. No, they are usually the person who works at Nestle, right? In the PR agency, in their PR department. Or, well, Nestle actually has a very well-defined sustainability division. So the people who work at Nestle's sustainability division, so they're the ones who are implementing the company's policy on the ground, right? They're not necessarily creating these definitions of sustainability, but what they are doing is doing the work of sustainability. And I borrowed that term, doing the work of sustainability, from a colleague and friend of mine, Jeremy Fike, who of course also addresses a broader framework of research, which really looks at what do you mean by doing of work? Work is just done, right? Well, not quite. Anytime you do work, it's a process of coordination, right? People have to be on the same page with each other. You have to understand each other. Or in other words, you have to share meaning. That term, shared meaning, is basically a staple of the communication discipline, right? Communication is all about creating shared meaning. If you do not have shared meaning, if you are not on the same page, you are not going to have coordination, and work is not going to actually happen. So in my research, I really draw from this other theoretical movement, which looks at how the doing of work itself happens through communication, right? So if you take that perspective, what that tells you then, right, is that these people who work at Nestle or Reliance or any other company on the ground, well, fine. They're not maybe the ones who are writing these fancy policy reports, right? They're not writing a Brundtland report. But in order for them to do the work of sustainability effectively on the ground, they have to be creating meaning or understanding about what sustainability is in the first place, right? And so that meaning of sustainability has to actually, it does not originate necessarily from those policy reports. It originates from the actual coordination of activities, right? The translation of activities, the transmission of information, the engaging in dialogue with each other. All of these are different communicative processes, if you can think about it in that way, right? There are acts of communication that are really important for work to happen. So that was basically what I was interested in. How does communication help in the doing of work, and specifically in the doing of sustainability work? But why is this important? I hear probably many of you asking in your heads, beyond a very esoteric academic question, why is this important? Very obvious answer why this is important is, well, if people are not, again, if more people, not just in one company, But Nestle is now working in a vacuum, right? Neither is Reliance, neither is the government of India or any other organization, the United Nations, that's involved in climate activities or sustainability work. All of them have to work together, and we are interconnected, right? It's the systems approach way of thinking. So if you do not have some semblance of shared meaning over here, if you have this very clear disconnect between what the policymakers are saying and what the practitioners are doing and what the common people, people like you and I, are thinking sustainability means, if there's a disconnect across all of these levels, well, the planet is screwed. You can forget about affecting, the global warming. There's really not going to be much help at all. So from a very practical standpoint, you do need to understand what the people on the ground are saying and doing, because they're the ones who are actually doing the work. Some of you who do social development work probably associate this with a grassroots perspective. And it is very much a grassroots perspective way of thinking about doing work, right? And thinking about, well, what does this work kind of mean? So hopefully that answered your question about, well, why is this important beyond just the esoteric theoretical nature of doing work and thinking about this in terms of communication. So once I figured out that this was basically what I wanted to do in terms of my research, I went about designing my research project. So this was actually based on my dissertation, which wow, it seems a long time ago, which it was really. So for my dissertation project, I really wanted to look at how do these practitioners of sustainability work? How do they make sense of the work, right? What do they understand as sustainability work?
Rahul,
yeah.
Hi, just before you go forward, just wanted to point out, so there are some questions in the chat. So as you go further, maybe you could just keep an eye, and wherever you think, okay, this is where I can pause and I can answer those questions, maybe you could answer them, or we could also take all of them later at the end of your talk, which is fine. But either way, but I just wanted to just direct you to the chat messages. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I really hadn't had a look at them. So the one that I think I do want to address right now is, what do you mean by sustainability work? And that's really that's a really great question. Arun, thank you so much for asking that. Because at the time I did this research, honestly, I'm not sure that there was a consensus about this either. Because the United States ILO and the ILO, for instance, defined green jobs, right? They did not define sustainability work. And to my understanding, I don't think sustainability work was really defined per se by, again, a policymaker. But guess what? Who tried to define it? The practitioners. So the International Society of Sustainability Practitioners, ISSP, they did define sustainability work. And they were largely led by the green jobs definition. So you do see some sort of overlap there, but not quite. The ISSP also, it wasn't a perfect definition, because they did a very traditional, what I would call a traditional mistake. This distinction between hard skills and soft skills. And they said, you have sustainability work with hard skills, and so you are the water resources engineer, or you are so basically more engineering sort of work. And then you've got the soft skills work, because guess where communication and PR and all of these other people were shuttled into the soft skills approach. Fundamentally, that approach is problematic because it emphasizes not only a distinction, but a hierarchy. Hard skills is prioritized over soft skills. And again, with the climate problem, that's not necessarily true. We have wonderful technology. We are developing the technology all the time. I mean, the leaps and bounds that we've made, for example, in electrical batteries, for instance, is testament to that. The problem, though, I think, is primarily in terms of changing the hearts and the minds of people, right? To understand that what a low carbon economy is going to be. So, so sustainability work, green jobs. That was pretty much the. Again, you had these competing terms that sort of meant the same thing, but not quite. And that was one of the issues that I really wanted to address. What do practitioners mean by sustainability work? So thank you for asking that question. So again, going back to the literature, again, research is so funny that way. I realized that, when we're talking about what specific work means to people, there is a distinction. Specifically, there are two theoretical concepts. One is called the meaning of work. And this really comes to us from, vocational psychology, like way back in, so you got job performance data, for instance, which is really all about the meaning of work. Meaning of work tends to focus more on the societal definitions of what a particular line of work means, right? So you're a doctor. I'm Bengali, so I grew up. You know that my parents, of course, prioritized me to becoming a doctor, a medical doctor. Not a PhD doctor. That doesn't matter. So that was that societal understanding of what a medical doctor is, or what a sustainability practitioner is, basically would fit under that category of meaning of work. There's another category, though, called a meaningfulness of work. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Meaningfulness of work is from vocational psychology. Meaning of work is really more from the sociology of work school. So, how is meaningfulness different from meaning of work? Well, because it tends to focus more on individualized, personalized meaning making. Yes, I might be a medical doctor, but do I really buy into the hype of being a medical doctor? Or have I gone through years of ragging at Ames, for instance, and decided that this is not for me? It doesn't do something to me, to my soul, right? So that was basically what the meaningfulness of work construct tried to get at. Most of the research on meaningfulness of work, however, tends to take, because it comes to us primarily from psychology, it tends to take what is called the package perspective, which basically means, look, you've got a stack of 5 packages, and each of these 5 packages affect your meaningfulness of work. Autonomy, really important, right? The more flexibility that we have at work, the more meaningfulness we derive from it, generally. Salary, of course. These objective characteristics of work are really, really important. And around the time that I was examining this, starting work on this research, a somewhat different approach was starting to gain a lot of currency. And that was a tensional approach to meaningfulness, which basically said that, the packages approach is nice, but it's a little too simplistic, because you don't just add A, B, C, and D in a particular combination and voila, you've got your meaningfulness of work index. They might compete with each other, right? Or the relative value of the package might change as your life progresses, as your career progresses. So they were really looking at a more tension-centered perspective, which said, there's going to be a little bit of tension. There's going to be a push and a pull effect with some of these things and factors that we really take for granted with work. So I really started adopting that tension-centered perspective to meaningfulness of work over here. And so those were, I guess, the two major research questions I had for my dissertation. Those were pretty much the two major research questions for the articles as well that I discussed. So I am going to share my screen here just liquidly, just to show you what those articles are, and then you can probably find them. Right. So let's start with this one. Even though it was published later on, this was what I would call RQ1. And this really gets at, I think, the question that you asked, Arun, which was really about, what do you mean by sustainability work? Great question. How do practitioners describe sustainability work? Now, in the article, you'll find that basically, so Patrice was my PhD advisor, and so I added her name since this was part of my dissertation. In case you're wondering who is this other person. So in terms of, again, theoretical framework, along with all of those frameworks that we've also talked about, I used one more, and that was called discursive positioning theory. And that actually comes to us from sociology and linguistics. So there's basically what it says is, how we understand a particular thing tells us a lot about our identity, right? If I'm an academic, for instance, a large part of my identity, Rahul's identity, is definitely ground up in what I think of as, in terms of my academic identity. So really, I was really looking at, well, how do people really understand their everyday work practices over here when it comes to sustainability work? So I'll cover the methods part really quickly, because the methods part was really common across both papers. So essentially what I ended up doing was I did in-depth interviews with around 45 practitioners. And so again, related to the question that was asked earlier about, how do we define who a sustainability practitioner is? This is part of the time where, your participants' self-definition can be really, really important. So I really was guided through LinkedIn. LinkedIn was becoming really popular around that time, especially for, more for unprofessional groups. And so LinkedIn had a number of professional networking groups around sustainability. And so essentially I targeted 3 LinkedIn groups for those who are presently working in sustainability, and emailed members of the groups to ask them, if they wanted to participate in the project. There were a lot of emails sent because, I was a poor graduate student, so I definitely did not have access to the paid version of LinkedIn. If you do have access to the paid version of LinkedIn, it allows you to send a systematic email blast to all participants, which is, I think, really, really helpful now. But back then, basically, I scrolled down and emailed each person, and essentially hoped for the best. So around 250 emails were sent, and we really heard back from around 85 participants overall. We asked them to really self-select. Do you think of yourself as working in the field of sustainability? And if they did, then we asked them, well, what field or what subfields do you work as? And obviously, the qualitative questions went into a whole lot more detail, especially about your everyday work, your everyday experiences, and how they connected their everyday work experiences to the definitions of sustainability. So, can you all see my screen, or is this better?
It's fine.
Okay. So the interview protocol, it's about the interviews each lasted about, and they were long interviews that lasted about 60 minutes, more or less. And they really began with these large-ended, open-ended questions. I really like to begin. So my expertise, methodological expertise, as Beverly said, is in interpretive methods. And I find a lot of benefit to really just asking people to tell me a story about this, or tell me who you are, because it really gets people to just share a lot about really the context, as well as how they see themselves fitting into the context. And that really is the essence of discursive positioning. How do you position yourself in a context? So after the tell me the story of your career question, we asked them about daily work experiences. What do you find pleasurable? And then they said, well, I like this. Well, can you give me an example of an episode where you really found that pleasurable? And then similarly, unsettling aspects of the work. And you really have to pay attention, I think, to even these terms like pleasurable or unsettling, because again, keep in mind, with the meaningfulness of work literature, I really wanted to go against the grain of that the package version, right? Saying that A, B, and C are all good things that contribute towards meaningfulness of work. And instead, I wanted to go for this tension, right? So this tension between what is pleasurable and what is unsettling. Arguably, even the term, what do you find meaningful about your work, is it's kind of a loaded question, right? Because it's, the word meaningful itself we associate with a positive valence, something that's good about your work. However, we all have, have found work to be meaningful also because of the challenges that we have encountered in different capacities. And so I really wanted to get at how those challenges and those positive experiences sort of butt against each other. So basically that was pretty much the interview protocol. This article, you've got a table for research participants' demographics. So we used constructivist, we used grounded theory basically to analyze the data. If you're not familiar with grounded theory, I'm sure many of you are. This is by far one of the most popular methods of doing qualitative analysis. But definitely learn about grounded theories. I won't spend too much time with that. I'm just watching the clock. So what did we find exactly? And remember, our question was, how do practitioners talk about sustainability, right? What does sustainability work mean for the people who are doing the work of sustainability? And one of the things we discovered was that people really tended to talk about the work that they were doing in terms of 4 kinds of story clusters. And so we call these story clusters discovery, enlightenment. Oh, here we go. Oh, that's sort of the wrong way. So I apologize for that. So if you sort of shift your head a little bit, you can probably read that. Discovery, or I can probably do this. Discovery, enlightenment, legitimacy, and consumption. And so what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, practitioners are not naive. And that was really important because, you know, I think the people who do the work of sustainability are often critiqued by both those on the right as well as those on the left. Activists say that practitioners are very naive, right? And they're really not going far enough when it comes to the political project of climate change and other environmental issues. Whereas on the right, of course, you have some other folks saying that, you know, if you work in this field of sustainability, you are a tree hugger, right? From the Chipko movement, which began in India, of course. You're a tree hugger. You are not pragmatic at all. You are basically very much with the Greens, and you have given up all claims to being a business graduate. And that's not true. Neither of those perspectives are true. So one of the things we realized, well, they're quite evident in these stories, is that practitioners are very clued in to these tensions that they're subjected to, as well as, and so because of that, they're very sharp about how to navigate these tensions accordingly. We thought going in that the strongest challenges that they would talk about to doing sustainability work would be external stakeholders, be policymakers, regulators, activists, media persons, consumers. No, they're actually talking about how it was so important to convince the boss, to do lateral, or convince the boss, or even lateral explanations, right? And if it really makes a lot of sense. If you work in Reliance, because I use Nestle for far too long, you know, you are still a relatively new division of this company. And people are going to look at you and say, well, what do you want all this extra data from me for? You know, that's a lot of work. I don't want to do all that work. And what's the benefit of this work? So instead, these practitioners realize that they really have to work with their co-workers and their colleagues in other divisions to really make them understand, why was this work so important? How did it align with their existing work, right? What were the dividends? They also had to work with their supervisors because, you know, let's be honest, a lot of CEOs say the right things about climate change, environmental issues, business responsibility. They don't necessarily always do the right things, right? And so for the practitioner, that was also part of the challenge, to really try to ensure that what was promised was actually delivered, right? So looking at that gap between rhetoric and reality becomes really, really important. So these were some of the challenges that I talked about. So where do these subject positions come in? These subject positions became really important in terms of them deciding how to talk about these challenges to these different stakeholders. So in one context, for instance, practitioners really focused on the discovery subject position. So what do you mean by discovery? Well, the idea of discovery was, we are creating something new. We are discovering something amazing, and it's new, and it's going to really rock our world. That's the broad idea, right? But it could be, so here, let me pull this up over here. Sorry. Oh, there you go. So this is where discursive positioning theory sort of became important, to sort of map how people were talking about the subject position to the emergence of the subject position. So we found that, when people were talking about sustainability work in terms of discovery, and they said that, this was really what's going to really change people's mind in this context, they used these three discursive resources, or what I would just say in lay language, I would say, these are the ways that they talked about sustainability work to their stakeholders. So they talked about sustainability as growing the organization's practices, right? They talked about it in terms of setting new benchmarks that were really, really important. In terms of recognizing that you cannot have discovery without also having normative struggles, right? The old norms and the new norms will always clash. And so recognizing that those struggles were important as well. Seeing a little question. So we did not actually do that, and this is a fantastic question for next research. Because this was a qualitative study, we didn't really have a representative across all different geographies. So we didn't really do that over here. But great question again for follow-up research. So hopefully that showed you something about how discovery happened. The next part, I just want to end with this. So it's sort of like a continuum, right? What did this discovery actually do? Or why did practitioners say that they found this discovery subject position really helpful? Well, because they said that in doing that, it really helped them emphasize how sustainability was really key to contemporary organizations, and how this was not, value-based necessarily. It was not my political instincts. It was very much grounded in data, so evidence-based management, right? And again, it allowed them to emphasize how sustainability was innovative, lean principles. So there's this, again, melding of traditional business school discourse, as well as some newer language that they're adopting. And that's really important for them to be able to address these tensions that they're finding in their work. So similarly, for the other subject positions, we found for enlightenment, for instance, practitioners were really talking about education, how education and learning was absolutely vital. Strategic collaboration was really key. And then not just improving systems, but transforming them. So again, very much focus on enlightenment. So honestly, when I was thinking about naming these clusters, I was definitely thinking about the Buddha over here. I mean, enlightenment principles with the Buddha is really all about reaching a higher plane, right? And so they really talked about, how their role as sustainability practitioners, or part of their role, was in fact helping the organization reach a higher plane of understanding who they were, in terms of the overall economy and planet and all of that stuff. So then with legitimacy, they were talking about integrating with mainstream operations, right? So you couldn't, because they recognized that if you only talk about sustainability as something new, like discovery, what's the obvious danger going to be? Pushback, right? This is new. We don't want to do this. We've done without this for tens of years, decades of years. We don't need to do this again. So there was a really, really vital need for practitioners to talk about sustainability in terms of how it was, in fact, a very legitimate and, dare I say it, a very traditional focus on the focus of the organization. I've done research, for instance, on Indian companies doing CSR, and one of my projects looked at Tata. And Tata does this amazingly well, right? They really talk about their legacy as a company, and they talk about, well, what does this really mean in terms of the trade guilds of India? And so again, emphasizing legacy, emphasizing tradition as a way to talk about legitimacy is really effective. So upholding the establishment, and also reporting for existing standards, right? So it's not just creating new standards, but also making sure that the best of the current standards that we have right now are in fact being upheld. And then finally, with consumption, this was also really important because practitioners also realized that, we, for better or for worse, we are operating in a capitalist economy. And we kind of need to make the case for consumption, but what they try to sort of do is make the case for ethical consumption, right? So emphasizing market rule. But market rule is, I don't have to tell a group of business school folks that market rule is so grossly misinterpreted often in policy and media circles, right? So sort of going back to the traditional meaning of market rule. Again, talking about self-branding, right? About how focusing on sustainability would help not only the practitioner create their own brand, but also the company create its own, brand based on sustainability work. And then I mentioned ethical consumption. Some of them call it green consumption, some of them call it ethical consumption. I think these days, green consumption is sort of winning out more in terms of green product side, whereas ethical consumption is much broader. So broadly speaking, that was how they really tended to talk about sustainability work. And you see over here a very pragmatic underlying, right? I mean, because they recognize that, to do their work effectively, they'd have to convince a lot of stakeholders. And a lot of these stakeholders were within their own organization. And so that was kind of the main goal that they really had. So it's 10:30 a.m. over here. With you, it's probably, what time is it there?
8.
8.
Just
so let's
about 8 p.m.
stop it here. Yeah. I don't think that we have enough time for the other one, but Jen, of course, I will send the other journal article as well, and this might be also interesting. But I would love to hear your thoughts really on what you are seeing in terms of the doing of sustainability work in India right now. Oh, I should stop screen sharing.
Yeah, that's better. Okay. I think we've got a fairly broad category of audience here. I'm not sure anyone's actively working on sustainability or sustainability work. So you may not get an answer to that question.
No worries.
Okay.
Should we take some of these questions in the chat?
Yeah, you could do that. Can you? Okay, Arjun is saying, can you share your journal article link? Arjun, I will do that. I will do that right now before we end the webinar. I'll just share the link right here so everyone can access it. I think so. I did have. Yeah, you could take one of the questions that's put up in chat. The other thing maybe I was hoping you could do. So I see some of our PhD students here or PhD candidates here, and I just, for their benefit, so one of the most, I think one of the most crucial things when you're in a PhD program is the methodology, right? Like understanding the methodology and getting that right. And I was thinking if you could just elaborate a little more on how you teased out different themes and how you sort of created the connect or saw the connections. Yeah.
Right. um, so I cannot stress enough how important it is to be systematic about your methodology. And a lot of, I think, students, especially when they're just starting out, often tend to think that I think both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, I think, sort of go through misperceptions quite a lot. And so as far as the misperceptions on qualitative methodologies are concerned, the main misperception is, of course, that it is not systematic. It is entirely subjective. And that's not true, right? Because different qualitative methodologies have different criteria that you are using to identify themes, to decide what is important, right? What are you going to tease out from the data that you are analyzing? So I actually teach the qualitative research methods graduate seminar at Wayne State, and we redid the syllabus last semester. And one of the ways that I redid the syllabus was emphasizing the different kinds of methods that there are to analyze qualitative data. For instance, you could be looking at stories, which is narrative analysis, right? With narrative analysis, you really have to think about, so if in an interview, for instance, if the practitioner was really talking about an episode that happened, right? Then using narrative theory to think about, well, what is the scene that was constructed? Who were the actors in this narrative? What was the underlying moral principle that was really important over here? Those are the sets of criteria that really become important in that method of analysis, which might not be important in a different method of analysis. So I guess all of this is really to emphasize that different methods it is important to pay attention to, I guess, the nuts and bolts, the nitty gritties of each different method, because they really play a huge role. The other thing that you should be concerned about when you're selecting methodologies is, what is the nature of the data? Because that's really going to impact what kind of methodology you choose. If I had not asked my interview participants, for instance, tell me a story about this, or how did this episode play out? There would probably be very little about narrative theory to utilize there in the first place, right? So you kind of need to pay attention to, what exactly is the nature of the data that you are analyzing. What will that data, what can that data actually allow you to do, and what can it not allow you to do, right? Because you can't do everything with all sorts of data, right? And that's true for both quantitative and qualitative data. So you have to pay close attention to your data set and say, well, what kind of data do I have over here? How is this data organized? And that would probably impact the methodologies that you can then utilize for your project. The last thing that's really important for choosing the right methodology is research question. Ideally, your research question should be theoretically rooted, right? Because as academics, our job is to create new knowledge. We are extending theory. As Google says, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So your research question, either for qualitative or quantitative methodologies, cannot simply, be willy-nilly. It cannot simply be a question that was interesting to you and you simply ask it for the heck of it. So if you, so in my story right now, for instance, I began with what I found interesting, and then I sort of refined that by saying, well, how the theory and the literature that I really went through really helped me understand how that research question was going to sort of, work. So your research question has to be based on theory. Now, if your research question is based on theory, your methodology sort of has to work in tandem with it, right? So you can't really have a methodology which has very different assumptions about how the world operates, about the nature of reality. Like, this is where, words like ontology and epistemology sort of, become really important. If you are taking a subjective viewpoint with your theory, for example, tension-centered approaches definitely takes on a very subjective perspective, right? That, that person A's perspective is going to differ from person B's perspective, and there's going to be a tension involved. So if your theory is subjective, you want to make sure that your methodology is also subjective, right? That your methodology cannot be something that is objective and down, because what happens then is that it downplays the tensions that you are really interested in the first place. And so you're really doing a disservice to your research question if you did not choose a methodology that gets at the complexities of your research question. So that's actually the reason why we chose Kathy Charmas's version of grounded theory for this project. Grounded theory, there are a lot of different versions of grounded theory. And they really all range from the somewhat more objective versions to more subjective and tensional perspectives. So it is important to know those distinctions and really connect your methodology to your research question.
Thank you. It's great that you pointed that out at the end, because I think a lot of times people are not aware of how think of grounded theory as one thing, right? It's just one approach. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I'll just let me just check. Does anyone have questions? Otherwise, I think we can let everyone go.
I think I saw a hand up earlier from
Kapil. Yeah.
Yeah, just a question, just going by the definition of sustenance really early in the session that you shared, that development that needs meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations, right? Now, there is also a component of a genuine human ignorance. I can give you an example. For example, plastic once was seen as a very great innovation of the century. Right. Now, the current generation will be bearing the impact of that plastic waste. At that time, we didn't know. So we are in the same blind spot today as well. Let's say space travel is booming, right? We see it's a great innovation, but that may be very bad for the future generation. We don't know the impact. So how can the researchers or people in academics can help us understand from that point of view? I know it's a blind spot, but just had that question in my mind.
So it is so interesting that, again, that you raised that question, because one of my current projects is actually very much on that topic. For this current project, I'm working with a team from engineering, computer sciences, biology, and a couple of others. I don't remember who they were. But what we're basically trying to do is look at the mitigation of microplastics. And so microplastics are basically when the plastics break down into really, really small little microparticles, or in some cases, we actually manufacture microplastics, and that goes to a lot of our cosmetics, for instance. Those little bead thingies that the skin creams, for instance, used to have a lot of them at one point in time. And microplastics, we are now discovering, are harmful to the environment. They they can cause a lot of neurological damage in fish, and we do not yet know the exact physiological damage that they can cause, or if they can cause, to human beings, but there is a really big chance that they can, right? And so where I come into the project over here is, how do we deal with these, these risks that we are not entirely certain about, right? That we are now starting to develop knowledge about, but the knowledge is partial. It is not entirely wrong, nor is it entirely 100% right, up there. So what so one thing I would probably suggest is maybe look at theories of risk communication. So decision risk and management sciences, again, is another component I know. Management sciences, decision making, and risk analysis is really big over there. Risk communication sort of borrows a little bit from that area of research, but focuses specifically on, well, how do we now convey this risk, right, to policymakers or community members who now need to make the next level of decision. One of the things that I found in this research so far is that it's not only the uncertainty around this, whether it's plastics or anything else. Often there's a lot of uncertainty about how policy works or about how science works. Okay, so science does not work by simply, giving you a clear and definitive answer and saying, voila, you've got it. You've got the answer. That's not how science works, right? There's this falsification, right? Or there's this constant process of refining your results. And we're sort of seeing the ill effects of that right now with COVID-19, for instance, as the understanding of COVID-19 has become better over time, the guidelines have changed, and that can be confusing for a lot of people. So both, I think, the COVID-19 situation as well as the project I'm working on right now really suggests to me that we need to do a better job not only of talking about the uncertainties around these pollutants or these geological processes, but also our social and our institutional processes, like how science works, how policy works, and how people can be better empowered to be a part of these processes.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you so much for taking my question.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rahul, for joining us. Okay, Arjun is saying policy making and risk management communication should be directly proportional. Right.
Should. Key question, should.
Yeah, so I was saying thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for those of you who are still here at almost 8:15 p.m. On a Friday evening. It was a pleasure having you here, Rahul, and hope to read more of your work.
Thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful Friday night.